This is the next to last session that we'll have together in this class talking about the shadows of Hebrews. Whether that's an occasion for celebration for you or an occasion of, oh man, already, that's all right. We've been talking about some of these topics in kind of a loose way, and we've really made some primary points that I really want to drive home and make sure that we understand as we think about the points that our author here in Hebrews is making. And several weeks ago, we talked about priests. And I think this is really one of the main points that he makes about our daily walk as priests. We'll see some more of that as we continue. I'm going to say that we've wrapped up chapter 10. And as much as I hate to do it, we're going to skip over chapter 11. It doesn't really deal so much, well, it has to do with some of the shadows for sure. But I believe the purpose of chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, is to remind these Hebrew Christians that you're not abandoning your heritage. These are still our heroes of faith. These are still the people that we admire and we long to learn the lessons that they taught us and to be inspired by their faith. And their faith is like our faith. And I think that's what chapter 11 is about. Largely, as we just give a big overview here, to give inspiration for them to endure the difficulties that they were going through. And so he ends in chapter 10 by saying, we're not like those that shrink back. Look at these great examples that we have of our Jewish heritage. And then we move on into chapter 12, and he's drawing conclusions now. So chapter 12 is very much like chapter 10 in terms of here are some take-home lessons. Here are some conclusions that I want you to reach. But if you really want to know what chapter 12 is about and what he's driving at, in my opinion, you have to go all the way to the last part of chapter 12 and read verse 28 and 29 with me, wherein he says this, therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. This is the point that he's been driving at. We are priests. And it is what do priests do? Priests worship. And specifically, what are we to do? We are to draw near to God and offer our sacrifices. As is pictured in the times of the tabernacle, those priests preparing themselves to draw near to the tabernacle, representing the presence of God, to offer their service and offer their sacrifices, offer their worship. That is a picture of you and I, this kingdom of priests that God has called out and gathered us together. And so we draw near. We draw near to the presence of God. Now I want to make some clarifications for us, just in case, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. When I say that we are priests that draw near to the presence of God, I'm not talking about our assemblies exclusively. Certainly, our assemblies are an opportunity for us to draw near in a very special way because we're coming together with our brethren. We call this corporate worship. We're drawn together. But let me tell you, priests are priests every day and everywhere. Right? I've been throwing out some thought questions pretty much on a weekly basis. I have another thought question I'm going to plant right now, and we're going to see if it doesn't generate a little bit of conversation in just a minute. I want you to think about occasions where prominent religious figures, whether they're TV evangelists or prominent pastors or preachers or maybe elders or preachers that you know, have been discovered to be living an immoral life or pursuing some kind of fleshly lasciviousness, and they're exposed for that. And what happens with that is that there's typically a lot of attention that is drawn because of that, right? That becomes a big news story. If it's a high-profile preacher that is known widely, that becomes a big news story. If it's among our fellowship, maybe not somebody that is known widely, it is still a big deal to us. If a preacher or an elder is caught living a double life. And I want you to think about that and discuss with me your feelings about that. And we'll talk about that in just a few moments. Okay? And delve into that just a little bit. So here in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, he's driving toward the end. And as I said, if you really want to see what he's driving at, those last couple of verses there kind of give us a summary of that. And his summary is this: we have been given a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And he's referencing some of the previous verses for sure, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about that just a little bit. But he gets to this point of us offering to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe. There are different translations for that word service. Does anybody have a different word in their Bible? Or service, as I read there, whereby which we may offer to God an acceptable service? Worship. So there are several translations that renders that word service as worship. And I think that's an appropriate translation. I think service is fine as well. But anytime we read the word worship, it draws us and our imaginations into, again, this concept of drawing near to God. Approaching Him with our offering. Making a sacrifice. Now, when we get to chapter 13, this is going to be another big topic. Because in chapter 13 and verse 10, he talks about an altar. And he says, we have an altar. Up to this point, it sounded like he was doing away with all of the altars. But now he says, we have an altar. And we offer sacrifices at this altar. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week. It's an interesting discussion. Now, let's go back to this thought question that I had. What are your thoughts about a high-profile religious figure who is exposed for a double life? What are your thoughts about that? Yes, Rick.
Man we thought a lot of. Yeah. We loved him a lot. He left South Florida, went backwards home to Kentucky, and wound up in prison for running a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
It broke our heart.
Yeah.
It just absolutely broke our heart.
I'm sure it did.
I think that when we have these things happen, it's almost like a double standard. You're just horrified that this has happened at this particular level of people. As if it's not okay, but if it happens to somebody that we think it at a lesser level in spirituality. In that case, it's really not the case. I mean, everybody should be being thought of equally and the same, although one seems to be more
outrageous?
outrageous than whatever.
Let me throw out let me be clear. This is not a true event, okay? All right, I'm one of your elders. What if you're driving and you see Bruce's white truck parked in front of a strip bar? And you say, well, what in the world with Bruce's? Is that really Bruce's truck over there? What? And your curiosity builds. And so you go and you look at the truck and you say, yeah, that's Bruce's truck. What in the world? And you go to the doorway of this establishment and you look in and you see Bruce in there with a strong drink in his hand and participating in the lasciviousness that is going on inside that establishment. This is an example. What do you think about that? Yes.
With many people that I know, if I saw that, I would call 911 because you had a brain embolism. I'm serious. There are some things that are so far out of character that I would think, oh, this is some kind of severe emergency.
Okay. So you call 911 and you discover, well, he seems to be functioning okay physically. What's going on here? So
I would not call Cece. There would be 911.
all right. This is an example. Did I say that already? Okay. Yes, get this.
That's really spectacular, because and we get really disappointed when people do something spectacular in the way of sin. And less spectacularly, I think we all have sin. And we're not going up front and confessing that every Sunday. So in a way, we're leading a small little life ourselves that way.
We're all of us are frauds on some level, is what Gentis is saying. And I don't disagree with that at all.
And in scenarios you're talking about is, it's wrong in any state, we understand that, we know that, but I think the reason we pull a higher level, to answer what your original question was,
Higher level.
because there seems to be hypocrisy that's way beyond from someone that
Yeah, and then the consequences of that.
which we should all preach against it, but when it's in that regard of what you're speaking of, that's a whole other level.
There are more far-reaching consequences of what you're saying.
And we'd let the air out of your tires, by the way.
All right. So I get confronted about this, okay? I get confronted and I say, look, I'm a private citizen. I'm not breaking any of the laws of the land. I'm not on duty as an elder. I've compartmentalized my life. This is part of this life. Now, I'm not going to bring any of that into the assembly. Okay? So just so you know, I'm not, so that's my defense. How do you like that defense?
Terrible.
That's terrible. Why?
You are on duty 24/7, 365. You're living for Jesus Christ. You have said you are a shepherd of this flock. And you know full well, according to what the Word says, that what you're doing is wrong. Even though it may be legal, doesn't make it right in God's eyes. And the unrepentant attitude. If you had said, oh, you're absolutely right, and I repent, and I need help, and help me escape from this, those are further reaching consequences than denial, or I don't mean denial, but unrepentant.
Right. So this defense of me compartmentalizing my life that's not going to fly. Okay. That's not going to fly because as an elder, I'm to be what? Above reproach? Well, when I'm here, I'm above reproach. How about that? When I come into the assembly, can I be above reproach here?
You may be, yes, please, but,
Please. Okay.
but not only here.
Well,
Because,
our
yes,
job as Christians is to be above reproach, and we're to be lights and examples. And in any scenario you have, I'm not talking about someone high profile, but we personally, whether it's friends or family or coworkers or whatever, lose credibility to be that light.
there's all kinds of problems with my reason. All kinds of problems. But just to boil it down to its basics, it's not because I'm an elder. It's because I'm a priest. Right? So priests don't say, all right, I'm going to live with reverence when I'm in the assembly. Do they? They should live with reverence within the assembly. What about outside the assembly?
More so.
More so or the same, at least, yes. So there's not a switch that we flip coming into the doors of this assembly that says, all right, now it's time for reverence, right? Do we all understand that there's not a switch that we flip? So, all right, now is the time for us to be reverent. I'm to be reverent when? All the time. Yes, Gary?
The point of Hebrews is we're all priests.
Yes! We're all priests. And what that means is I'm drawing near to God in my life. Not just in my time in the assembly with my brethren. All of the time. And so the demands of reverence are upon me when I'm in this assembly and when I'm outside this assembly. Right? So the way that I speak inside this assembly should be very much consistent with the way that I speak outside of this assembly. Can we all agree on that? That we don't put on some facade, we don't put on some act when we assemble with Christians. The way that I dress in this assembly is going to be consistent with the way that I dress outside of this assembly. Right? The way that I conduct myself with people is going to be consistent both inside and outside. My point is, there's not something about the assembly that makes us different, or we should conduct ourselves in some artificial, holy way. We are priests 100% of the time. And we must recognize that. I am not going to get by with the argument, well, I was on my own time. I have that compartment in my life. It is my job to live by the high standards of respect and awe of God and reverence of God all of the time. And so if my life is described by Romans 12 verses 1 and 2, then I am a living sacrifice. I'm a living sacrifice. That's what my life is about. I'm a priest. I'm offering worship to God in my home. By the way that I train my children. By the way that I interact with my spouse. By the way I conduct myself with my co-workers. By the way that I interact with my classmates. Those are means by which I bring my acceptable service and my worship to God and lay it upon the altar. That is what life is as a priest, which we all are, as Gary pointed out. And that is the point that he's driving at with these brethren, We have received this kingdom. What an awesome thing that is. A kingdom that is forever. A kingdom that cannot be shaken like this earth can be and will be. A kingdom in which we function as priests, drawing near to God in our life, in our home, in our workplace. We're drawing near to God. So we should not think exclusively about the assembly as a time to flip a switch. That's not who we are. We're priests all the time. All of the time. And since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, these people who live by faith, what do? We lay aside the encumbrances. When we come together on Sundays? No. In life, all of the time, 24/7, we lay aside every encumbrance that can entangle us. And we run with endurance the race that is set before us. Well, when do we do that? Every day. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, sat down at the right hand of God. We lay aside these entanglements. We run with endurance. We fix our eyes on Jesus. And then this next section, he says, we even have regard for the great difficulties of our lives, as though God himself were issuing the discipline for us to be trained by these difficulties. Looking at difficulties of life as the discipline of God. It's a remarkable frame of reference for an author who most likely had endured hostility and difficulty in his life because of his profession of faith. Now, you haven't resisted to the point of shedding blood yet, he says. None of you have become martyrs for your faith yet. But you are suffering some difficulty. So, understand. And don't hold with contempt the discipline that God would issue to his children. Understand that this can build your character. This can strengthen your faith. This can cause you to have greater respect. We had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? He says in verse 9. They disciplined us for a short time, it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. His holiness, his distance from common things, his separateness from the physical realm, his unity with all things spiritual, his holiness. All discipline is unpleasant, he says. Not joyful. It's sorrowful. But to those who have been trained by it afterwards, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. When you go through some things because of your faith, you hold firm. Does that cause your faith to be weaker or stronger? His argument is it makes your faith stronger. Stronger. It's sorrowful. It's difficult. It's hard. But it has fruit. And so he goes on to make some more conclusions in verse 12. Strengthen the hands that are weak, the knees that are feeble. Make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint by the beast. Be upright, be holy, be righteous, walk on straight paths. In the assembly, all the time. All the time. You are a priest. All the time. Pursue peace with all men, and the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God. And no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble. By it many be defiled. We've got to stay on track. Pursuing peace, pursuing sanctification that comes only through the blood of Jesus. Remember what he said about sanctification previously. And then he brings up this example of Esau. Esau, he's described as a godless person because he sold his birthright for some food. And I think the point that he's making, obviously, with Esau here is that Esau had a very poor value system. His valuation of a birthright was diminished to the point that he would trade that for food. What's he saying to these Hebrew Christians who are tempted to abandon Christ? You would trade your birthright of sanctification in Christ? You're like Esau, who would trade his birthright for food, and he lived in regret over that. He wanted to undo that so many ways and for so long. But he couldn't undo it. And he was rejected because of it. Don't be like Esau. Have your value system finely tuned for the spiritual things. Understanding your mission as a priest. Priests don't say, now is the time for me to be irreverent. Now is the time for me to stand in awe. Now is the time for me to fear God above any other time. The priest recognizes it's always time to be in reverence of God in every activity and in every way. In this next section, he makes this very stark contrast. We talked about this a little bit already, so let's just read this together. He paints this picture of Mount Sinai and what was happening there. And he's saying, yeah, that's not the mountain you're going to. You have not come to a mountain that may be touched in a blazing fire, to darkness, gloom, and whirlwind, to the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words, which sound was such that those who heard begged for no further word should be spoken to them. For if they could not bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. You didn't come to Mount Sinai, he said. You weren't there at the foot of the mountain gazing at the awe and the power of the God that was so frightening that you begged not to hear it anymore. It's something even more awesome that you've come to. Wow. More powerful, more meaningful than God shaking Mount Sinai with his thunderous voice on that day, you've come to something more meaningful. You've come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than the blood of Abel. That's where you come. Something much more substantial than the shadow of Mount Sinai. You've come to this mountain of God. This plan of God to gather his people on his mountain, Mount Zion, and to his city, the city of the living God, to his heavenly Jerusalem, not the physical Jerusalem. You've come to God, the Spirit, the Judge. That's who you come to. That's who you're approaching. You're drawing near to that one. And you wouldn't think of drawing near to that one without reverence in every way, right? Not just on Sundays. You draw near with reverence to that one every day. And in every interaction. And in every seemingly meaningless duty that you perform. You maintain your reverence and awe of God, and it changes everything about you because you are a priest. Now, probably should say something about this. I've preached, and I know you've heard sermons many times about criticizing religious groups who have this clergy-laity distinction, right? Kind of goes hand in hand with that first illustration that we were talking about. We hold the clergy to a higher standard than we do the laity, because there's a difference. Among God's people, in some religious groups, there's a difference between a lay person and somebody who is identified as part of the clergy. And that's not a New Testament concept at all. There is not a clergy-laity distinction in the New Testament. And many times now I think that as we've taught that over the years, we kind of leave the impression that we're all lay people, that we're all in the laity. And the truth of the matter is we're all in the clergy. And that changes things altogether, doesn't it? We're all clergymen, clergywomen. We all have taken on this mantle of priesthood. All of us who have been called by God are members of clergy. Yes, we all have that standard that is innate within us to understand that there is a greater expectation among the clergy. Priests are clergymen, right? And if you are part of this kingdom of priests that God has called us to be, then you can, when you go to the hospital, park in the clergy spot. You can do that without fear of violating your conscience. You are a clergyman. Don't park. Or do what you like. Live by your conscience. Yeah, there is no distinction between laity and clergy. But understand, you're clergy. We all who are have come to God in this kingdom of priests. You've come to Jesus, the mediator of this new covenant, and to that sprinkled blood which is so meaningful as he's described in so many of the previous verses. A blood that speaks even better than the blood of Abel. And so see to it that you don't refuse him. Jesus, the antecedent of that, him. In verse 25, see to it that you do not refuse him who is speaking, his blood that is speaking. For if those did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, much less shall we escape who turn away from him who warns from heaven. There are so many of these warnings, dire warnings, that the author of this epistle gives to us. This is one of those, for sure. We've seen several of those other stark warnings. And his voice shook the earth then, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more I shall not only, I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. And this expression, yet once more, denotes the removing of those things which can be shaken as a created things in order that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. I hear you. All right. All right, I already read those last two verses. So we're done with chapter 12. Read chapter 13. We'll conclude our study next week as we talk about the altar that we serve. Thank you.